He takes us to places and involves us in adventures that are greater than anything we can imagine for ourselves. And that's just what people on this first podcast need to be willing to do.
Welcome everyone to Real Talk Episode 1, the inaugural episode for our YouTube and podcasting channel. And if you haven't read my guest name in the description yet, let me introduce you. If you don't know, he is the pastor here at the Pentecostals of Quinte, the Section 3 presbyter for the Ontario District, our Ontario North American Missions Director, the former youth president, and this is all great, and he's done it all, but more importantly, he is the husband to Sister Stephanie and father to Michaela, Brooklyn, Abby, and Luke. I'd like to welcome my pastor, Shawn Stickler.
Well, thanks for having me on for the inaugural episode.
That was a pretty intense intro, little sporty to that, but how are you doing today?
Appreciate that. We're doing great. It's a beautiful day out, and here we are, Real Talk number 1.
Real Talk number 1. So what? Just a little background for everyone, because this is the first episode. The goal of Real Talk is to just give everyone a little behind the scenes of the lives of our pastors and ministers that you might see day to day, week to week on videos or at your local church. But we want to just give everyone their story, and that's the goal we're going to start with today. So Pastor Shawn, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, most people discern, at least up here in Canada, pretty quickly that I didn't grow up here in Canada. This accent is, well, when I go home now, they say I have a Canadian accent. Home for me is in Delaware, where up here they say I have a southern accent. It's not a southern accent. It's a northern accent in Delaware. But I grew up in Delaware, went to a great church in Dover, Delaware, a very large church. And in that time, there weren't a ton of really big churches, but I was blessed to be a part of that. I was born in Miami, Florida. That's a little secret fact not many people know about. They wonder why I'm a Miami Dolphins fan. That's why. Generations of Miami Dolphins fans in the Stickler family. And because I was born in Miami, my family's from Miami. But most of my remembering life, as a kid is from Delaware and growing up in Delaware. So, and then, of course, maybe we'll get to this in a little bit, but I met my wife there, Stephanie, who came to the church in Delaware. We had a Bible school at the church and met her there, and we felt to move to Canada, and I've been here now for 22 years here in Belleville, so wow. I'm not going anywhere.
Wow, that's a quick kind of synopsis of your life to get to where you are today. But let's rewind it a little bit. Let's kind of go back to the roots. So you said your family's from Miami. Long term, that's where they're from, but they moved to Delaware at some point. Kind of what was the stage in the family's life to decide that we're going to uproot from where we've been for so long to a new place?
You know what? That's an interesting story that very people know about my family, or kind of why I am who I am today. My dad had planted a church in Miami, Florida, and he had been from there. He had grown up there and felt to plant a church there. And he did that. And to be honest with you, circumstances and situations, he ended up closing that church, and that church merged with the larger church in the Miami city area there. And he was working for the railroad, for Amtrak, and a job opportunity presented itself in Delaware. They didn't even, what's Delaware? It wasn't on their radar. And this is, when you look back, you can see the hand of the Lord on all of it. They didn't know. They just, I'm sure they prayed about it, but they were moving to Delaware. They picked up their family. I think he wanted a fresh start. Felt like, kind of wondered what God was doing, knew he was called to plant that church, and kind of wondered a little bit maybe what God was doing. But we moved to a little town called Middletown, Delaware, went to church in Dover, Delaware, to Brother and Sister Trout's church, and we were faithful there. My dad and mom took us to church, my brother and I, and we were just faithful saints in the church. And grew up in that church, and that's where I got a lot of my understanding of ministry, culture, church culture, and all of those things. Is that okay that screen?
That's okay. For those watching on YouTube, this is our first one. We've got this for on the podcast.
Signal. Does
You'll
that mean
also
I'm no
have
longer,
to watch it on YouTube.
No longer in the flow. Is that to tell me to change? What's going on here?
That was just our signal that you're talking too long. But so you mentioned you have a brother. Mm-hmm. You have a brother. Is it just the two of you?
Just the two of us, yeah, just me and my brother, and he also now works for the railroad, actually, also works for Amtrak. My dad retired from Amtrak, and so there's that in the family, too. You know, part of the story that we got interrupted when the screen went by there and distracted us, my dad later got involved in ministry at the church there in Dover and eventually planted a church himself again in Middletown, Delaware. And I throw that out there because as we're talking about the circumstances that kind of form who you are, you know, I watched my dad sit as a saint in a church. I was not old enough to remember his days as a church planter. I got to see him become a leader in our local church there and then to plant a church. And so, but probably his greatest ministry was throughout those years to my brother and I. And I often tell people, even though he was not active in full-time ministry in the church plant there, he took it upon himself to teach my brother and I the Word of God. And I can remember him giving us Bibles and pens and highlighters, and he began to teach us the oneness of God. And he would tell us, highlight this verse in your Bible and make notes. And you know, my first Bible school was my dad, was my teacher. And we would sit around the kitchen table, and he would talk to us about the coming of the Lord, and we would talk scriptures and preaching. And so a lot of what I gleaned from ministry was not just how we were involved in the church, but it was really in our home. My dad was teaching my brother and I.
I understand completely where you're coming from. My father being a pastor of many years and also right now a pastor of a little home missions work, how even myself, I find myself in ministry now, but when I actually think back, because I didn't go to Bible school, I'm giving people some advice and also teaching, and I realize I sound like my dad.
Sure.
And that kind of carries with you, and you don't realize it in the moment that you absorb so much information from your parents, and why I'm so thankful for that. Because without his kind of knowledge over the years, and I'm sure you feel the same way, you would not be near where you are today without that.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, I had the similar thing. There's a few people in our church, you know them, who actually attended online Bible study with my dad, and they were making fun of me this week saying that I literally sound like my dad, like tone and intonation and all of that. So, of course, there's a message in that for anybody watching. I know a lot of young adults will watch this, and who knows who else will. But what we do at home really does matter.
Absolutely.
And we're both products of that, of homes that were dedicated to the Lord and were boldly dedicated. And we're who we are today greatly because of the influence of our family. So I think that's just relevant to our conversation here, how important that is.
Absolutely. So that kind of covers your growing up stage, and like you mentioned, a lot of young adults, for the most part, will be the ones watching this. So let's kind of shift to that time of life where kind of my age, maybe a bit younger, maybe a bit older. For yourself, being in a family that was so ministry minded, when you come to the point of your life where high school is done, kind of what was next for you? Were you going to follow the footsteps of your father, or were there career aspirations?
Well, at that time, my dad was leading in the church. He was a teacher, Bible study teacher. He was involved in the ministry team. He hadn't planted the second church yet, but he was involved in ministry. So we were involved in that manner. I can remember as a kid in the youth group. Now, when I say kid, I'm talking 16, 17, 18. In those days, when I was a young person, in those days, we didn't have all these screens and podcasts. But I tell you what was different is when you turned 18, that was it, right? There was no young adult ministry. That wasn't the focus of that day. Even youth ministry was still, I hate to say it, there was youth ministry, but it was still evolving, you know. And I can remember at our church being one of the first churches that had like a youth group and a youth service, you know, and those type of things. So and at that time, when you turned 18, you were done. That was it. And what are you going to do? And I really wasn't ready for that. What am I going to do? And what happened is my youth pastor at the time invited me to continue to help with the youth group and the youth team. And so I think I was teaching a lesson once a month, and probably didn't even start there. It probably started with a devotion or something. And that was it. You kind of phrased the question a certain way. I didn't have any ministry aspirations at that time. Like, I shouldn't say that. I felt like God had a calling on my life. I felt like I had heard from God, but I didn't see any of this. I certainly didn't see Canada or Ontario. Didn't see any of this. I knew God wanted to use me, and I had submitted to that. And, at every altar service, I could feel that kind of tug, I don't know how else to describe it except a tug from the Lord that I need something more from you. You can be involved more, and what are you going to do now? And just that feeling every time I prayed that there was something that I needed to surrender to the will and plan of God. And like I said, it started with just my youth pastor at the time saying, will you continue to help with the youth group? I did. I was a chaperone. I was, once a month teaching a Bible lesson that they handed you the lesson. If you could read, you could do the lesson, And that was really how it started. And to be honest with you, from there, Nathan, it was just literally saying yes when I was asked to do something.
Right.
So, it started with that. And then my pastor, I remember him having a meeting with myself and about 5 other young people who were clearly feeling the call of God on their life. And he explained to us how we were important to the church and to the future of the church, and how he wanted to use us and get us involved. And then we all started to get plugged into some other areas. So he asked me if I would teach part of our discipleship class. And of course I said yes. And so we were teaching discipleship, maybe, I think I was every other week. That evolved to, will you teach the class yourself? And I'm probably 20 years old, right? And I'm teaching every week a discipleship class. And at one point he asked me to preach. I need to go back and find that original sermon. I called it Unanswered Prayers is what it was. Okay. And I preached that first sermon. It probably wasn't very good. In fact, I remember, I very rarely tell this story, but I felt like it had gone pretty good.
Right.
And I, there was, how it is when you preach. Somebody coming, that was great. That was amazing. That was the best sermon I've ever heard. So I went to my youth pastor, and he was kind of a bit of a mentor to me at the time. And I said, what'd you think? I was kind of broad-shouldered, I was feeling pretty good about it. I said, what'd you think? He said, it was all right. And it kind of crushed me, but I also needed that because there was a lot of growth that I had to do as a preacher. And it forced me to think, well, how can I do better? And what can I do better? And that's important because most people don't want to hear. I was mad about that, Most people don't want to hear the truth.
Absolutely.
But the truth helps us to become better. And I had a guy in our church, one of our leaders, that I had that type of relationship with, that we were working on with him in his ministry. And he would come to me after speaking and say, tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. What did you think about it? And I would say, well, your speed, you went too fast. You need to show a little more passion, those type of things. And he became a great, great preacher. I'm not saying because of my influence. I'm saying because sometimes we need that realistic, right, truth conversation. Anyway, so from there, got involved just wherever I could, teaching discipleship class. I was even the worship leader at the time at my church.
I do remember you mentioning this. I've heard a couple.
Hard to believe.
I've heard a couple little runs you go through in the offices.
It was one of those. I had a very strong worship team. We had, in those days, the choir was the worship team, a whole choir. So all you really had to do was lift your hands and clap a little bit, and encourage people to worship. And I was that. And I felt really, I began to get uncomfortable at this stage in my life, in that I felt like that God had called me to work with young people. And this is an important story for somebody. listening right now, because I felt like uncomfortable. I didn't know, I didn't understand, because the door had kind of shut for me to work with young people. I had moved on into discipleship and these other ministries, and had stepped away from the youth team. I don't remember the circumstances as to why, but I kind of wondered what God was doing, because I felt that I was called to work with young people. Not only that, I felt like I was called to work with the youth group that I had grown up in. The problem is the job wasn't available.
Right.
What do you do when you feel called to a job that's not available, right? And I do think this is an important conversation for somebody who might be listening right now, because I didn't know. I mean, I felt that from the Lord, but that door was not opening per se. But I remained faithful, and this is why faithfulness is so important. Faithfulness and accountability. I remained faithful. I remained accountable to my pastor. I stayed connected with the leaders of my life, and I had just gotten married. Literally, Stephanie and I had just gotten married. We went on our honeymoon. We came back. We got married right here in this church. A lot's changed since then. Where we got married is now the banquet hall. And came back from our honeymoon here to Belleville. Was sitting in my in-laws' basement when my pastor called. We didn't all have like cell phones like we do now. And so he called their house, and I took the call at their house and said, I need to meet with you as soon as you get back. And I said, okay. And when I got home, the youth pastor that I had grown up under and who had mentored me had had a moral failure and was removed immediately, and was leaving his wife, and had left town. And here was a youth group now with no youth pastor. And my pastor at that point appointed me to be the youth pastor, Stephanie and I to be the youth leaders of that youth group that I knew God had called me to lead. And that wasn't an easy situation, because he was well loved. And literally one Sunday, they've got one youth pastor, and the next week they've got a new one. And that was challenging. Wow. That was a great leadership learning experience for me in a number of ways. One, how to step into a difficult situation and navigate that and lead. But probably the greater leadership lesson was, when God's called you and speaking to you, you have to be able to wait for God's plan to come to pass.
Absolutely.
If I had gotten mad and said, you know what, I'm leaving this church because I know I'm called to work with youth, but I knew what God was speaking to me. I didn't know that 1 week out of the blue, I would have to fill that role. And that's why waiting on the Lord and trusting in the Lord is so important when you've got a word from the Lord. And you know, people are watching this that probably have felt called to ministries that they haven't seen the door open up to yet, that they haven't seen kind of that doesn't feel like it's moving at the pace that they should. I talk to young people all the time that's there. I feel like I'm called to do this, but there's no opportunity. God's timing is absolutely perfect. It is absolutely perfect. His timing is everything. And I just want to encourage somebody to stay the course, to don't get discouraged, to trust God's timing. And God knows when you're ready. And God knows the situation that's coming, and he's preparing you. And the key is this: you just say yes to every door the Lord opens and every opportunity that comes your way. And the Lord takes care of that and places you. And here, again, in that place, I was leading the youth. I still didn't know I was going to move to Canada. I thought I would be a youth pastor till the day I died, you know?
Right.
And there's another set of stories leading to that. But I don't want to take too much more time on that.
That's all right. That's a good little background that I'm sure definitely probably most people up north don't know.
No, they probably don't know that history.
But that's the point of this podcast, is to give a little bit of history on everyone, to see kind of what it took, what kind of sacrifices it took to get to where you are. Because you're not handed things like this. You know, you don't work so hard to grow a place and nobody kind of recognizes that. It's not handed to you. The work goes in over time just by saying yes. Yeah. Once a week, once a month even, just saying yes leads to this kind of thing. But
well, and also, when I started saying yes, it wasn't to preaching on Sunday. Saying yes to being a part of the youth team was setting up chairs.
Absolutely.
Right? we had our youth room was not as nice as yours. And our youth room was our banquet hall. Well, I guess it was a similar situation. Our youth room was our banquet hall. And I had to, every service, take the chairs down because through the week we had a school and it was the cafeteria for the school. So every service there was a setup of chairs and a takedown of chairs. And sometimes I could get kids to help, but a lot of times it was me and maybe one other kid setting up the chairs and tearing them down. But even then, God was preparing me. And again, you say yes to whatever opportunities to serve in the kingdom of God come your way. And God continues to give you more opportunity when he knows he can trust you with setting up chairs.
Absolutely.
Right? When he knows he can trust you with turning off the lights and just being faithful in those things, then he opens up the opportunities for the bigger things.
Right. Absolutely. So we've covered kind of your little ministry background, and I'm sure we could end up doing a part 2 of this with you, and we probably will. But now the ministry, we've kind of covered your background to get you up until youth pastoring before your move to Canada. But before you officially moved to Canada, you got married. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, how you met Stephanie, and kind of go off from there.
Well, I mentioned that there was a Bible college at the church that I grew up in, and it has since closed. Funny thing, the year that Stephanie came, I don't remember if she did 1 year or 2 years. I think she only did 1 year. They announced the school was closing. So there was a lot of people getting married that year at Bible college, okay? So she came to the Bible school. They announced that the Bible school was going to close and people were getting engaged like crazy, okay? That didn't happen to us, but Stephanie came there to the Bible school, and I can remember the first time that I saw her coming out in the back of the church. And, they say about love at first sight. I don't know if it was love at first sight, but I certainly noticed her at first sight. And I, of course, didn't know this is the woman that I would marry. You got to be careful on these things. So I gotta make sure I edit this portion of the story correctly. She did end up serving on the youth team that I was serving on. That was one part. And of course, we were dating. She actually, we did not get engaged when the Bible school closed. It wasn't an immediate, let's get engaged. She stayed around and was going to secular college as well. I was going to University of Delaware. I was not attending the Bible school. I was doing business administration at the University of Delaware. She came to the Bible school, did a few classes, but the majority of her work was at a college there for accounting. And so she stayed after the Bible school closed, and we were able to continue to date and those things after. And, of course, we got engaged. People do know this story, but some people might not. When we got engaged, we were on a walk, and she had an apartment there, and we would do walks, around the block and that type of thing. We were engaged, going to get married. And at the time, I had no intentions to move to Canada. And I had this, you're trying to figure things out. You're trying to set some boundaries. I needed her to know I'm the man, I'm in charge, right? I'm going to set, the Lord will speak to me about where we're going to go. Come on, somebody, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to, and you know what the Bible says, wives are going to submit to their husbands. Well, this podcast will be canceled just because I gave you that scripture.
We might have to edit that out.
Oh, we might have to edit that one out. So I'm letting her know who's in control. And again, pre-marriage, I didn't know anything at that point. If I could go back and tell myself, I'd train myself differently. And on one of these walks, I said, listen, Stephanie, I need you to know I will never move to Canada. That just shows you about the will of the Lord.
Oh, my.
I said, I will never move to Canada. She was crying. She was like bawling, crying. You're saying you'll never move to Canada. And I was doing one of those, well, if you really love me, that won't matter because, I'm just stupid stuff. And she's crying, I will never move to Canada. And can you imagine Nathan, God up in heaven?
He's got
laughing.
He's got a sense of humor.
He's laughing. The angels, I don't know if he told him why he was laughing. I don't know what, but he's laughing because most of my ministry has been up here in Canada. So, but again, never say never. Never shut the door. Never. God takes us on journeys. You never thought you'd be in Belleville,
No, absolutely not.
God takes us on journeys and takes us places that we can't imagine or think through or plan for. That's why you just have to say yes to God every day, because tomorrow, I don't know what adventure he's going to take us on, right? But you say yes to God every day and you serve where you can and you trust God. And when you're faithful to God and you just continue to say yes to God, he'll even take you to Canada when you've said you'll never move
vehemently
to Canada.
No.
She was crying, bro. It was terrible. It was sad. And God was laughing, and she didn't know. And the funny thing was, when we eventually did move to Canada, which is another story, she didn't want to come to Canada. She was very happy in Delaware. She was very happy with our life, and she had a great career there that she walked away from when we came up here to serve in the church here, and had to trust God. And she really didn't want to leave. It was the Lord had spoke to me, ironically.
Yes.
And we agreed. It wasn't just to me. We had prayed and agreed together, and felt to move to Canada. But she was crying when we left Delaware. So.
Yeah, we might have to get her on the podcast to give her point of view.
Well, that would be a different point of view for sure. But what she could tell you is the story of walking away. She had a very good job with DuPont, and had a great future, and was doing very well. She'd gotten her CPA, and this would be a good conversation. She'd gotten her certified public accountant in the States, and literally when we drove across the border, she had just gotten that. She said, well, that was kind of a waste. Right? Because now here she has moved to Canada. Well, God's perfect timing, she now uses that in her business here in Canada, and has been very successful with her business. Again, not knowing, just walking in the will of God.
Absolutely.
Right? And you can talk to her about that.
Yeah, no, we'll get her on here for sure. That kind of covers most of the topics we wanted to talk about in this first session. I'm sure we'll be doing another one at some point, because it's interesting when talking to you, everyone would assume, oh, you probably did your time at Bible school, you served right away, and then you tried out to become a preacher somewhere, and then now you're here. When in reality, probably for the most cases, that's not how it works. It starts off by people saying yes and just going wherever God leads them to go. Because it's like you mentioned, there's no way if you told me a year and a half ago I'd be here, not a chance. Right. There's no way. I would probably laugh at it. So would my wife. And if you told me I'd be speaking every week, I would laugh at that. And so would my wife again. But look at us now. What's that, Paul read?
It's the saying yes, right? And when you just say yes to the doors that God opens, and saying yes isn't right, because it's not just saying yes, you got to walk through the door. Right. When you walk through the doors that God opens, he takes us to places and involves us in adventures that are greater than anything we can imagine for ourselves. And that's just what people in this first podcast need to be willing to do. Right. Trust the doors that God opens and be willing to walk through them, and trust his timing and trust his plan for their lives. And if they follow that, it's going to be good.
Absolutely.
It's going to be good.
And if you're a young adult looking to get married, find a Bible school that has one semester left. Go apply. Meet everyone. Get your ring before school starts.
Having said all that, a lot of those people didn't stay together, so maybe not the best.
Let's edit that out of the podcast. But thank you for coming. We're going to cut that right there, because I believe we could do a part 2 on the Canadian side of things. So again, thank you for tuning in to Real Talk. Be sure to follow on our podcast, on our YouTube, on our Instagram for more episodes like this one, where you kind of get a behind the scenes of all the ministers and leaders that you might know in your life. Thank you again, Pastor Shawn, and thank you, everyone.